If the love of your life were lying in a hospital bed, unable to move or speak, how would you honor your vows? Would you stand by them, waiting and hoping? Or would you give in to temptation, making choices that could lead to irreversible consequences? This is a story of love, betrayal, and an unforgiving fate, a tale of a woman who gambled with morality and lost everything in the most unimaginable way. Malik and Deja Carter had what many envied, a seemingly perfect marriage. High school sweethearts from Atlanta, they had defied the odds, building a life together from nothing. Malik, a self-made entrepreneur, ran a thriving real estate firm, pulling them out of the lower-income neighborhoods they had grown up in. Deja, a former model, transitioned into high society seamlessly, her beauty and charm making her a beloved socialite. Their journey to success was far from easy. Malik had spent years grinding, working multiple jobs while studying business at night. He had watched his mother struggle to keep the lights on and vowed that his family would never experience the same hardships. His ambition was relentless, and while it brought them wealth, it also came at a cost. Deja, once his biggest supporter, began to feel like a shadow in his life, craving the intimacy they once shared. Deja, on the other hand, had always been the center of attention. Born and raised in Atlanta, she was the youngest of 3 siblings. But she had always stood out. Her beauty was undeniable even as a child, with striking features that made people take notice. By the time she was a teenager, she had been approached multiple times by modeling scouts, drawn to her poised presence and effortless charm. Her mother, a seamstress with dreams of the fashion world herself, nurtured Deja's ambitions, sewing custom outfits for her early photo shoots and pageants. Deja's rise in the local modeling industry was swift. She graced billboards, appeared in magazines, and was well on her way to making a national name for herself. She had offers to move to New York and Los Angeles, promising a glamorous future. But then, she met Malik. He was unlike anyone she had ever known, ambitious, disciplined, and completely enamored with her. He promised her stability, love, and a life of luxury that would make all her sacrifices worthwhile. Against the advice of her agents and mentors, she chose love over career, trading the catwalks for dinner parties and high society functions. When she and Malik married, she put those dreams aside to become the perfect wife and mother. At first, she embraced the role, relishing in the security and admiration that came with being Mrs. Carter. But as time passed, she couldn't help but feel like she had lost a piece of herself. The invitations to modeling gigs stopped coming, and the calls from old industry friends faded. She missed the thrill of being desired, the feeling of being seen, the intoxicating rush of flashing lights and adoring crowds. And no matter how many lavish vacations or designer dresses Malik bought her, the emptiness only grew. Despite their love, the cracks in their marriage deepened. Malik was often absent, buried in work, while Deja found solace in the lavish lifestyle he provided. She immersed herself in charity events, high-end galas, and social gatherings, but the void in her heart remained. They were a picture-perfect couple on the outside, but behind closed doors, their conversations grew shorter, their touch colder. Then, tragedy struck. They had it all, a lavish home in Buckhead, 2 beautiful children, and a love story that seemed indestructible. But beneath the facade of perfection lurked tensions neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Malik was often absent, buried in work, while Deja felt neglected, missing the passion they once had. She craved excitement, the attention she had once drawn effortlessly. The distance between them grew in ways that neither could ignore. Their conversations, once filled with laughter and shared dreams, became mere exchanges of logistics. Who would pick up the kids? What needed to be done around the house? Malik, exhausted from the pressures of running his business, dismissed Deja's complaints as frivolous, unable to understand that she felt more like a ghost in her own marriage. Deja, on the other hand, longed for more than just financial security. She had always been admired, praised for her beauty and charm, but now she felt invisible. The man who once worshipped her barely noticed her anymore. Nights spent alone in their sprawling mansion felt suffocating, her loneliness growing with each passing day. Her frustration turned into resentment. While Malik expanded his empire, she struggled with the feeling that she had traded her dreams for a gilded cage. She told herself she would never be the kind of woman who looked elsewhere for fulfillment, but the thought of being truly seen, of feeling desired again, lingered in the back of her mind. And that dangerous longing would soon set off a chain of events that neither of them could have ever anticipated. Then, tragedy struck. The accident that changed everything. One rainy evening, Malik's car was found wrecked on I-285. He had been on his way home from a late-night meeting, but he never made it. The impact was catastrophic, crumpling the front of his luxury sedan like paper. The rain had slicked the roads, making visibility near impossible. But that wasn't the only factor. Investigators later discovered faint traces of tampering in the brake lines, something that raised more questions than answers. First responders arrived at the scene to find him unconscious, his pulse weak, his body barely clinging to life. Shards of glass from the shattered windshield embedded themselves into his skin, and his ribs had caved in from the sheer force of the crash. There were no skid marks on the road. His car had gone straight into the guardrail, as if he hadn't even attempted to stop. He was rushed to the nearest trauma center, where surgeons fought through the night to keep him alive. As the news broke, media outlets ran wild with speculation. Was it truly an accident? Or had someone wanted Malik out of the picture? And if so, who? As Deja arrived at the hospital, her heart pounded, not just from grief, but from something else. A gut-wrenching feeling that Malik's accident may not have been as random as it seemed. And deep down, she feared that the answers might lead back to her. By dawn, the verdict was in. Malik had suffered severe brain trauma, multiple fractures, and internal bleeding. Though the bleeding had been controlled, the swelling in his brain left doctors uncertain if he would ever regain consciousness. Machines kept him breathing, but to those around him, he was a shell of the man he once was. Deja was thrust into a nightmare she had never prepared for. The media swarmed the hospital, reporters clamoring for a statement from the grieving wife of Atlanta's most promising real estate mogul. Cameras captured her tear-streaked face as she clutched Malik's hand, begging him to wake up. But as days turned to weeks, her hope started to wane. The loneliness was unbearable, the silence in their once lively home deafening. She tried to hold on, telling herself that Malik would want her to be strong, but the weight of uncertainty crushed her. Would she be forced to care for a man who might never return to her? The thought terrified her, and in that vulnerability, the seeds of betrayal were sown. At first, she stayed by his side, playing the dutiful wife. The media covered her teary-eyed hospital visits, painting her as a grieving, devoted woman. But behind closed doors, her patience waned. The loneliness crept in, and the thought of spending the rest of her life tethered to an unresponsive man terrified her. Then, she met Trey. Trey was everything Malik wasn't. Spontaneous, wild, and dangerously enticing. A club promoter with a reckless charm, he had been circling Deja for months, waiting for the right moment. Vulnerable and desperate for a connection, she fell into his arms faster than she could rationalize. It started with secret meetings, whispered phone calls, and stolen kisses. Before long, Malik's hospital room was nothing more than an obligation she resented. The affair was intoxicating, a high she hadn't felt in years. Trey made her feel alive, desired. But what started as an escape soon spiraled out of control. Malik's brother, Jermaine, had always been suspicious of Deja. He knew her type, women who thrived off status, who saw men as stepping stones rather than partners. When he noticed her late-night absences, the way she dressed differently, the new glow she carried, he began to dig. Jermaine's instincts told him something wasn't right. He had noticed Deja's growing detachment, the way she had stopped bringing the kids around as often, the way her social media presence remained picture-perfect despite the tragedy that had befallen her husband. When he finally decided to follow her one evening, what he saw shattered him. Deja wasn't grieving, she was thriving. She stepped out of a sleek black car in a dress far too glamorous for a quick errand. She met a man at an upscale rooftop bar, her laughter carefree, her eyes locked on him in a way that Jermaine had only ever seen her look at Malik. A professional investigator confirmed his fears. This wasn't a one-time meeting. Deja had been betraying Malik for weeks, indulging in lavish nights out while her husband lay motionless in a hospital bed. Jermaine's stomach churned as he went through the damning evidence. The texts, the clandestine meetups, the undeniable intimacy in their pictures. His brother, a man who had sacrificed everything for Deja, was being discarded like a forgotten relic. Rage surged through him, but he knew he had to play it smart. He gathered everything, ensuring there was no room for doubt, Then, with a heavy heart, he sat down with Malik's parents, unveiling the truth that would shatter them. Deja had played the grieving wife for the world, but behind closed doors, she had embraced another life. And now, karma was coming for her. Jermaine wasted no time. He showed Malik's parents the evidence, and they were devastated. Deja had played the grieving wife in public while indulging in betrayal behind closed doors. But karma had just begun its work. What no one knew, what even the doctors hadn't suspected, was that Malik wasn't as unresponsive as they thought. He was trapped inside his body, aware of everything around him but unable to move or speak. And he had heard it all, every whispered conversation, every hushed confession, every stolen moment between Deja and Trey. He could feel the warmth of her touch when she held his hand for the cameras, but he could also sense the guilt in the tremor of her fingers. He heard her beg him to wake up one moment and then, in the next breath, sigh in frustration when she thought no one was listening. The helplessness was unbearable. He wanted to scream, to move, to do anything to let them know he was still there. The betrayal cut deeper with every passing day, an open wound that festered as he lay motionless. He listened as Trey laughed in his presence, mocking the life he had built. He heard Deja's soft giggles, her whispered promises to another man while he lay confined in his own body. The pain burned, but so did something else, an unrelenting fury. The days blurred together, but the rage fueled him. He willed himself to move, to fight, to return. His body refused to obey, but his mind was stronger than ever. He focused on every detail, every sound, determined that if he ever woke up, he would make them regret every word they thought he couldn't hear. And then, one night, something changed. A spark flickered in his consciousness, a glimmer of control. His fingers twitched ever so slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He wasn't gone. He wasn't defeated. And soon, Deja and Trey would learn the terrifying truth. Malik Carter was coming back. The hushed voices, the whispered confessions Deja thought were safe. The stolen kisses she shared with Trey in his hospital room when she thought he was a lifeless shell. He heard it all, and his rage built with every passing day. Then, one evening, the impossible happened. As if summoned by the fury burning inside him, Malik's body fought its way back. His fingers twitched, his eyelids fluttered. And then, after months of immobility, he woke up. At first, his vision was blurry, the harsh fluorescent lights above him piercing his retinas. His throat felt raw, as if it had been scraped with sandpaper. The beeping of machines surrounded him, his body feeling heavy, unresponsive. But he was awake. He was back. The room was empty except for a single nurse, who gasped when she saw his eyes open. Panic flickered across her face before she scrambled out of the room to alert the doctors. Malik's mind, still foggy, tried to process everything. The last thing he remembered was the screech of tires, the violent jolt of impact, and then, nothing. But his gut told him there was more, something sinister lurking beneath the surface of his accident. Then, a memory hit him like a lightning bolt. Deja. Trey. Their whispers, their laughter, their betrayal while he lay frozen in time. A slow, burning rage coursed through his veins, more potent than any drug that had kept him sedated for months. The doctors rushed in, checking his vitals, speaking in hurried tones. But Malik had only one thought, one purpose. He wasn't just back. He was ready. And Deja? She had no idea what was coming. The hospital was in chaos. Doctors and nurses rushed in, shocked by the miraculous recovery. But Malik had only one thought. Deja. The woman he had loved more than life itself had betrayed him in the cruelest way possible. And now, it was time for reckoning. When Deja received the news of his awakening, she wasn't thrilled. She was terrified. Guilt gripped her like a vice. She had written Malik off, convinced he would never return. And now he was back, and he knew everything. She sat frozen in the lavish penthouse suite that Malik had once purchased for her, staring blankly at the news alert on her phone. Miracle recovery. Atlanta mogul Malik Carter wakes from coma. The words felt like a death sentence. Her hands trembled as she clutched the phone tighter, her mind racing with panic. Trey was the first to call. You need to get out of town. Deja. Now, if he knows. Shut up, she hissed, pacing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. I can't just leave. He's still my husband. That man ain't your husband no more. Trey shot back. He's gonna come for us. Deja knew he was right. Malik wasn't the type to forgive easily. The calculated way he handled business, the way he never let a slight go unanswered, it all sent shivers down her spine. But she had to see him. She had to try to explain. Arriving at the hospital the next morning, her stomach twisted in knots. The moment she stepped into Malik's room, she felt his eyes burn into her. His once warm, loving gaze was gone. Now, his stare was ice cold, filled with the knowledge she couldn't escape. "You look good, Deja," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Must be all that mourning you've been doing." Her knees nearly buckled. He knew, and she was about to pay for it. He didn't speak to her immediately. He let her stew in her fear, waiting for her to crack. And when she did, it was explosive. "I was lonely," she screamed when confronted. "You left me alone for years before the accident. And then you were just gone." Malik's voice was calm, too calm. "And you repaid me by sleeping with another man in the same room where I was fighting for my life." Deja broke down, sobbing, but Malik had no tears left for her. Trey, seeing the writing on the wall, vanished before Malik could deal with him. But Deja had no such escape. The scandal broke out, and she became a pariah. Social circles shunned her, the media that once adored her now dragging her name through the mud. She lost everything: the house, the status, the security Malik had provided. Friends who once fawned over her beauty and influence now ignored her calls. Invitations stopped arriving. High-end boutiques that once gave her VIP treatment now regarded her with cold stares. The lavish life she had clung to slipped through her fingers like sand. With no money and no home, Deja was forced to take refuge in a cramped, run-down apartment on the outskirts of the city. The walls were thin, the plumbing barely worked, and the neighborhood was a far cry from the security and opulence she once knew. Gone were the designer clothes and luxury handbags, pawned for rent money. The fine jewelry that once adorned her fingers was now replaced by empty spaces, a constant reminder of the life she had squandered. The loneliness was unbearable. She had spent years surrounded by admirers, enjoying the privilege of wealth. But now, no one returned her calls. Even her so-called friends had abandoned her, distancing themselves from the scandal that had turned her into a social outcast. Late at night, she would scroll through old photos on her phone, lingering on images of lavish vacations, high-end galas, and the family she had so carelessly lost. She could barely recognize the woman staring back at her in the mirror. Her once flawless skin was now marred with stress lines of despair, her eyes sunken from restless nights filled with regret. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had traded everything for a fleeting fantasy. And now, all that remained was the cold, unforgiving reality of her choices. Then, in a final stroke of poetic justice, Malik filed for divorce and ensured she walked away with nothing. He even made sure their children were shielded from her reckless influence, winning full custody without breaking a sweat. Deja begged, pleaded, but Malik was unmoved. But karma wasn't done yet. Months later, as Deja tried to rebuild her life, a news report stopped her cold. Trey had been found dead, gunned down in a robbery gone wrong. But something about the details didn't sit right. The shots were too precise, too methodical. No valuables were taken, and the security cameras in the area had mysteriously malfunctioned that night. The whispers started almost immediately. Some said it was just the streets catching up to him. Others swore it was something more sinister. Deja couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some random act of violence. It was calculated. Was it Malik? Had he orchestrated the ultimate revenge? Her mind raced as paranoia set in. She started looking over her shoulder, jumping at shadows. Every unexpected knock on the door sent chills down her spine. She barely slept, afraid that one day, her fate might mirror Trey's. Because if Malik had truly set this in motion, she knew one thing: he wasn't done yet. And as Deja stood alone in her empty apartment, far from the luxury she once knew, she realized one thing: she had lost everything. And Malik, he had walked away stronger than ever, free from the woman who had betrayed him. Because in the end, karma never forgets. Then, in a final stroke of poetic justice, Malik filed for divorce and ensured she walked away with nothing. But karma wasn't done yet. Months later, as Deja tried to rebuild her life, a news report stopped her cold. Trey had been found dead, in a robbery gone wrong. And the whispers started almost immediately. Some said it was just the streets catching up to him. Others swore it was something more sinister. And as Deja stood alone in a cheap apartment, far from the luxury she once knew, she realized one thing. She had lost everything. And Malik, he had walked away stronger than ever, free from the woman who had betrayed him. Because in the end, karma never forgets. Betrayal always comes with a price. And sometimes, the cost is everything you hold dear. For Deja, her choices led her down a path of complete ruin. What began as a momentary escape from loneliness became the catalyst for her downfall. She had underestimated the consequences of her actions, believing that Malik's absence would grant her the freedom to indulge without repercussion. But fate had a cruel way of balancing the scales. Trust, once broken, is rarely mended. Malik had given Deja his all, his loyalty, his devotion, his wealth, only to be repaid with deceit. When he awoke, he didn't just reclaim his life, he took back his power. He ensured that Deja faced the full weight of her betrayal, stripping her of everything she had once taken for granted. And yet, the harshest punishment wasn't losing the money, the status, or the security. It was the loneliness, the realization that she had destroyed the one thing that had ever truly belonged to her, the love of a good man. Now, she lived in the shadows of her own mistakes, a cautionary tale of how greed, disloyalty, and selfishness can turn the brightest future into a never-ending nightmare. Because in the end, karma doesn't just take. Karma watches, waits, and then delivers a reckoning that no one can escape.